Street girl saves a man and his horse. What happened next was devastating. She, with her pure kindness, did the impossible. The man, burdened with guilt, never imagined the price he would pay. What happened next forever changed everyone's destiny. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The sun had not yet risen when Hope opened her eyes. At 6 years old, she had already learned that each day began with the same silent question. What would she find today to fill her empty stomach? The small clay house where she lived with her grandmother Teresa barely protected them from the scorching heat that was approaching, and the packed dirt floor was always hot beneath her bare feet. Hope got up slowly, trying not to wake her grandmother, who had been coughing throughout the early morning. The white-haired woman with calloused hands had done everything possible to raise her since her parents left in search of work in the big city 3 years ago. Since then, they had received no news, only the silence that echoed through the rural Appalachian landscape like a constant lament. The little girl picked up her worn cloth bag and went out through the door that never closed completely. The sky was still dark, but she knew every stone, every thorn, every trail of that arid land. She had learned from an early age where to find prickly pear roots, wild berries, and even some cacti that stored water inside. It was a wisdom that hunger had taught her, a science of survival that no school could offer. As she walked through the dusty countryside, her small, dried feet stepped carefully between the thorns. The hot wind was already beginning to blow, bringing with it the smell of dry earth and the promise of another difficult day. Hope looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise like a ball of fire, and sighed. Sometimes she wondered if there was anything beyond that dry vastness, if there were places where children didn't have to wake up thinking about food. It was when she approached a small, rocky elevation that she heard a strange sound. It wasn't the wind, nor the singing of the bluebirds waking with the sun. It was a different noise, as if something heavy was moving with difficulty among the rocks. Hope stopped, her heart beating faster. Living in that isolated place, any unfamiliar sound could mean danger. She carefully climbed up the small trail between the rocks, holding onto the thorny bushes to avoid slipping. When she reached the top, what she saw left her speechless. White horse, magnificent even covered in dust and sweat, carried on its back a man who seemed more like a shadow than a person. The animal moved slowly, as if each step was an enormous effort, and the man was leaning to one side, unconscious. The suit he wore had once been elegant. Hope could tell even with her limited experience. It was different from anything she had seen in her life. The dark color of the fabric was now stained with dirt, and something darker that she preferred not to identify. The man's hands, which hung loose at the sides of the horse, were white and soft, so different from the calloused hands of everyone she knew. The horse stopped when it saw her, and its large dark eyes seemed to be asking for help. Hope descended from the rock slowly, extending her small hand to touch the animal's muzzle. It didn't startle, just rested its hot head in her palm, as if it knew she was there to help. It was then that she saw the state of the man up close. He was breathing with difficulty, and there were wounds on his forehead and arms. He wasn't awake, but was mumbling words that she couldn't understand. Hope looked around at the empty vastness of the countryside and made a decision that would change her life forever. Even though she was just a child, she knew she couldn't leave that man there. Grandmother Teresa always said that God puts people in our path for a reason, and that helping others was the most important thing anyone could do. Hope grabbed the horse's reins with her small hands and began to lead the animal toward home. The path that she normally ran along took more than an hour. The horse, tired and thirsty, followed her steps confidently, as if understanding that this small girl was its only hope. Hope stopped occasionally to check if the man was still breathing, lightly touching his hand to feel if he was still alive. When they finally reached the small clay house, Grandmother Teresa was at the door, her eyes wide with astonishment. The woman had seen many things in life, but a 6-year-old girl bringing an injured man on a white horse was something that surpassed even her experienced imagination. "My heavens, child, what have you found out there?" asked Teresa, quickly approaching. "He was hurt, Grandma. The horse was tired too. I couldn't leave them in the sun," replied Hope, with the simplicity of someone who did only what they considered right. Together, with great difficulty, they managed to get the man off the horse and take him inside the house. Teresa, who had been a midwife and cared for many people throughout her life, examined the wounds with an experienced eye. They weren't accident wounds, she could tell. Someone had hurt that man on purpose. "Hope, go get water from the well. Also bring those herbs we collected yesterday," instructed the grandmother, already moving with the efficiency of someone who knew what to do in difficult situations. While Hope ran to get what her grandmother had asked for, Teresa carefully cleaned the stranger's wounds. The man was young, perhaps 40 years old, and even injured and dirty. It was possible to see that he didn't belong in that place. His clothes, though torn, were made of fine fabric. His watch, still attached to his wrist, gleamed gold even. Covered in dust, his hands were too soft for someone who worked the land. When Hope returned with the water and herbs, she found her grandmother pensive, looking at the unconscious man. "Who do you think he is, Grandma?" asked the girl, genuinely curious. "I don't know, my child, but whoever he is, God put him in our path, and our obligation is to care for him until he gets better," replied Teresa, preparing a tea with the medicinal herbs she had known since she was young. They spent the rest of the day caring for the stranger. Hope, with the natural dedication of children when they decide to help someone, wet cool cloths to place on the man's forehead whenever his fever rose. Teresa prepared teas and cleaned the wounds, murmuring prayers softly. The white horse was taken to the small enclosure behind the house, where it drank water with a thirst that seemed to be days old, and ate the little hay they managed to gather. The animal seemed as grateful as its unconscious owner. When the sun began to set, painting the rural sky with shades of orange and red, the man began to move. First there were only low moans, then movements of his hands, until finally he opened his eyes. He looked around, confused, trying to understand where he was. The first thing he saw was Hope's concerned face, who was sitting next to the improvised bed, holding a glass of water. The girl smiled when she realized he had awakened, a pure smile full of relief. "Are you feeling better?" she asked with a child's sweet voice. The man tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Hope, without waiting for a response, helped him drink the water slowly. It was the first time he had seen such kindness in a child's eyes, such genuine concern for the well-being of a complete stranger. Teresa approached, drying her hands on her worn apron. "Welcome back to the world of the living," she said with a warm smile. "You gave us quite a scare. How are you feeling?" The man tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his chest prevented him. Where am I?" he managed to ask with a hoarse voice. "In our home," Hope replied simply. "I found you in the middle of nowhere, all hurt. I brought you and the horse here." For the first time in a long time, the man felt something he had forgotten existed: genuine gratitude. He looked at that small girl with disheveled hair and patched clothes, and couldn't understand how someone in her situation could worry about a stranger. "What's your name?" he asked, still trying to process where he was. "Hope," she answered, not knowing that that name would be prophetic for both of them. The man closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the last few days. He still didn't know how he had gotten there, nor how he would get out. All he knew was that two strangers, a child and an elderly woman, had saved his life without asking for anything in return. When he opened his eyes again, Hope was still, there looking at him with childlike curiosity. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment. He had spent so much time being known for the power he wielded, for the fear he caused, that he had almost forgotten to be just a person with a simple name. "Richard," he finally answered. "My name is Richard." And so, in that humble clay house, surrounded by the vastness of rural America, began a story that would change the lives of everyone involved. Hope didn't know that she had just saved a man who carried secrets capable of transforming not only her life, but that of the entire community around them. The first days of Richard's recovery were like a revelation for both him and his saviors. Hope, with the natural curiosity of children, asked simple questions that left him thoughtful for hours. Why are your hands so white? Where did this beautiful horse come from? Why don't you talk like us? Each innocent question was like a mirror that reflected the abyss between his world and theirs. Teresa, with her wisdom from having lived a long time, observed Richard with more attentive eyes. She noticed in his gestures, in the way he spoke, even in the way he held the water, glass, that this man came from a place very different from their countryside. There was something in his posture, even injured and weak, that betrayed someone accustomed to giving orders, to being obeyed. Richard, for his part, felt as if he were in a parallel universe. Accustomed to luxury, to power, to the immediate obedience of everyone around him, he now found himself depending on the kindness of two women who possessed fewer material goods than he spent on a single meal. And the most disturbing thing was that they cared for him with a dedication he had never received, not even from those who depended on his money. Hope had created a routine of care that deeply touched Richard's hardened heart. Every morning, even before the sun had fully risen, she would sit beside his improvised bed and tell him stories her grandmother had taught her. Stories of princes and princesses, of talking animals, of magical places where there was no hunger or thirst. Do you believe in these stories, Hope? Richard asked one morning, genuinely curious about how a girl who lived in such difficulty could keep such imagination alive. Of course I believe, she replied, her eyes shining. Grandma says that stories exist to remind us that things can always get better, that even when everything's bad, there's always a way to change it. This phrase echoed in Richard's mind for days. Was it really always possible to change? He, who had built an empire based on decisions that harmed others, who had accumulated wealth at the expense of others' suffering, could he also change? As the days passed and his physical strength returned, Richard began to tell small fragments of his story. Not the complete story, not yet, but pieces he could share without frightening his hostesses. He said he was a businessman, that he came from the city, that he had had problems with business and needed to flee. Flee from what? Asked Hope, with the frankness of children. Richard hesitated. How could he explain to a 6-year-old girl that there were people who wanted to hurt him because he had destroyed their lives? How to tell her that there were entire families without homes, without land, without a future, because of his decisions? From people who don't like me, he finally answered, a simplified truth, but truth nonetheless. Teresa, who was preparing tea in the tiny kitchen, stopped what she was doing. There was something in Richard's tone of voice that worried her. Son, she said, approaching, I don't know what kind of problem you have out there, but while you're in this house, you can relax. No one will hurt you here. The simplicity of that promise moved Richard in a way he hadn't felt in years. When was the last time someone had offered to protect him without wanting anything in return? When was the last time someone had called him son with genuine affection? In the second week of his recovery, Richard was already able to walk around the small grounds surrounding the house. That was when he met the nearest neighbors, people who lived in conditions similar to Teresa and Hope. There was Mr. John, an elderly man who raised some goats on a small piece of dry land, Mrs. Mary, who made straw baskets to sell at the market in the distant town, little Joe, a 20-year-old who dreamed of having enough money to marry his girlfriend. Everyone received Richard with the characteristic hospitality of rural folk, but he noticed in their looks a curiosity mixed with distrust. It was obvious that he didn't belong in that place, and in a small community like that, any new person generated speculation. This man that little Hope brought, where do you think he really comes from? Richard heard them whisper when they thought he wasn't paying attention. That horse of his must cost more than everything we have put together, commented another, and those clothes, even torn, looked like they belonged to someone important. Richard felt the weight of these comments. He knew his presence was causing curiosity and even tension in the community. But at the same time, for the first time in a long time, he was learning what it meant to live simply, without the constant weight of power and wealth. Hope, oblivious to the adult's speculations, continued to treat Richard as if he were a family member. She showed him where to find the best wild fruits, taught him to identify plants that stored water, told him about every animal that appeared on the property. For her, he was simply Richard, the man that the white horse had brought into their lives. One afternoon, while Richard was helping Teresa fix a hole in the straw roof, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Richard, my son, do you have family, children? Someone who's worried about you?" The simple question opened a wound that Richard had been trying to keep closed. Yes, he had a daughter, Caroline, 8 years old, who lived with his ex-wife in New York. A girl he saw only on weekends when his schedule allowed. A child who called him father, but whom he barely truly knew. "I have a daughter," he replied, his voice choked. "She's almost Hope's age." "And where is she?" "Far, very far away." Teresa noticed the pain in his voice and didn't press the subject. But Richard kept thinking about Caroline for the rest of the day. Was she missing him? Had his ex-wife explained why he had disappeared? Would he ever be able to see her again? That night, sitting on the porch of the small house looking at the starry country sky, Richard had a conversation that would profoundly mark his journey of transformation. Hope sat down beside him, as had become her nightly habit. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Of course, little one." "Were you a bad person before you came here?" The question, asked with a child's natural innocence, was like a punch to Richard's stomach. How had Hope, at just 6 years old, managed to go straight to the core of his inner struggle? Richard remained silent for a long time, watching the stars. Finally, he took a deep breath and answered, "I did things that hurt many people, Hope, things I shouldn't have done. But you don't want to do those things anymore, right?" "No, I don't want to anymore." "Then you're not a bad person anymore," she concluded, with the simple logic of childhood. "Grandma always says that what matters isn't what we were, but what we want to be." This phrase echoed in Richard's mind all night. Was it really possible to leave the past behind? Could a person really change, not just on the outside, but on the inside? The next day, Richard made a decision. He would tell Teresa and Hope the truth, not all the sordid details, but enough for them to understand who he really was and what he had done. He owed them that much, after everything they had done for him. He waited until late afternoon, when Hope was playing in the yard with some corn dolls that Teresa had made for her. He sat with the older woman on the porch and began to speak. "Teresa, I need to tell you the truth about who I am." She stopped sewing and looked at him attentively. "I'm not just an ordinary businessman. I am the owner of many lands, many properties, and to get those lands I took them from families who had lived on them for generations." Teresa continued looking at him, showing neither surprise nor judgment. "I evicted families from their homes, from their lands, to build my developments. I caused suffering to earn money, and the people who hurt me, who left me in that state that Hope found me in, were families I had harmed." When he finished speaking, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he had told the complete truth about his actions to someone. Teresa remained silent for a few minutes, processing what she had heard. Finally she spoke. "Richard, my son, it pleased God that you should come to us. Perhaps this is the chance he is giving you to fix what was broken." "But how, Teresa? How does one fix a lifetime of wrong decisions?" "One right decision at a time," she replied, with the simple wisdom of someone who had learned from life. "One person at a time, one day at a time." That night, for the first time since he had arrived at that house, Richard slept deeply, without nightmares. He had told the truth and, instead of rejection, had found understanding. Maybe Hope and Teresa were right. Maybe it really was possible to change. Richard's revelation to Teresa had been only the first step of a much more complex journey than he had imagined. In the days that followed, he began to realize that admitting his mistakes was just one part of the process of change. The real struggle was happening inside him, between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. Hope, in her innocence, had become, without realizing it, Richard's greatest teacher. Every day, with simple gestures and pure words, she demonstrated values that he had lost long ago. When she found a sweeter fruit, she ran to share it with him and her grandmother. When she saw an injured bird, she cared for it with patience, until it could fly again. When any neighbor needed help, she was always ready to offer her small hands. "Why do you always help everyone, Hope?" Richard asked one morning, after seeing her take water to Mr. John, whose well had dried up. "Because when we help others, we feel happier inside," she answered, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And also because, when we need it, someone will help us too." This simple philosophy of life contrasted dramatically with Richard's world, where each action was calculated to gain advantage, where each gesture had a price, where kindness was seen as weakness. As his physical recovery was completed, Richard began to face pressures that tested his newly discovered conscience. One morning, while helping Teresa in the small vegetable garden she maintained behind the house, a man appeared who made his blood freeze. It was Mark Davis, one of his former henchmen, a man who had been responsible for convincing families to leave their lands. Mark arrived on a powerful motorcycle, wearing expensive clothes and dark glasses, contrasting brutally with the simplicity of the place. "I thought I'd lost you forever, boss," said Mark, getting off the bike with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There are a lot of people looking for you." Richard felt his heart race. He quickly looked toward the house where Hope was playing in the yard, oblivious to the danger that had just arrived. "What do you want, Mark?" "I came to get you, of course. Your business is at a standstill. A lot of money is being lost every day you stay here playing farmer." "I'm not going back," said Richard, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Mark laughed, an unpleasant sound that echoed through the silence of the countryside. "Of course you will. You're Richard Montgomery, the richest and most powerful man in this region. You're not going to throw it all away because of some peasants." Hearing his full name, Richard Montgomery, made all the memories of power and wealth come rushing back at once. For a moment, he remembered what it was like to be feared and respected, to have millions in a bank account, to be able to buy anything he desired. "I'll think about what you said," Richard said, buying time, "but I need a few more days to fully recover." Mark studied him with suspicious eyes. "All right, boss, but don't take too long. There are people who won't wait forever." After Mark left, raising a cloud of red dust, Richard stood in the middle of the yard, trembling, not from fear but from the fight that was happening inside him. A part of him, the old part, whispered that he was being foolish, that power and wealth were more valuable than the approval of a 6-year-old girl and an old country woman. Hope approached him, sensing that something was wrong. "Who was that man, Richard? You look sad since he left." "He was someone from my past," he replied, trying to smile. "Are you going to leave with him?" The simple question contained all the fear that Richard didn't want to see in the girl's eyes. For the first time in his life, someone was afraid of losing him, not for his money or power, but simply for who he was. "I don't know, little one. It's complicated." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stayed on the porch looking at the stars, weighing his options. He could return to his previous life, recover his empire, go back to being feared and respected. Or he could stay here trying to build something new, something better, even if it meant giving up everything he had achieved. Teresa joined him on the porch, bringing 2 cups of tea. "Can't sleep, my son?" "Teresa, what if I can't change? What if all this is just a fantasy?" The older woman smiled tenderly. "Richard, change isn't something that happens all at once. It's a choice that we make every day, every hour, every time we need to decide between right and wrong. But it's so hard. The most valuable things in life are always hard. If it were easy, everyone would do it." In the following days, Richard faced more temptations. Mark returned twice, each time more insistent. On the second visit, he brought news that shook Richard. "Your competitors are taking over everything. Boss, soon there won't be anything left of your empire." Richard felt a pang of despair. Everything he had worked for over the years was being destroyed while he played at being a good person in the middle of nowhere. Hope, as if she sensed his agitation, began to spend even more time with him. She told stories, showed him small treasures she found in the countryside, taught him games she had learned from other children in the region. One day, while they were walking together near the stream that ran a few miles from the house, Hope made a discovery that would change everything. She found, half buried in the dry mud, an official document that had fallen from Richard's clothes on the day he arrived injured. "Richard, what is this?" she asked, showing the wet and dirty paper. Richard immediately recognized the document. It was the deed to one of the properties he had taken from a family, the same family whose eldest son had been one of those who attacked him, causing the injuries that nearly killed him. Looking at that paper in Hope's small hands, Richard had a revelation. It wasn't just beautiful words about change and redemption. He had, in his hands, the real power to fix at least one of the injustices he had committed. "Hope," he said, kneeling beside her, "if you could help a family get back the home where they were born, would you do it?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "Everyone deserves to have a home, even if it cost you a lot of money." Hope thought for a moment, with the seriousness that sometimes takes over children when they realize that something important is happening. "If I could make a family happy again, I would give anything," she finally said. At that moment, Richard knew he had found his answer. It didn't matter what it would cost him. It didn't matter if he lost his entire empire. That 6-year-old girl who possessed fewer material goods than he spent on a single meal had just taught him the real value of wealth. The following week, when Mark returned for the third time, Richard was ready for him. "Decided to come back?" "Boss?" asked the man with confidence. "Yes, Mark, I've decided what I'm going to do," replied Richard. But there was something different in his voice, a determination that Mark couldn't interpret. "Great. When do we leave?" "You're going to leave alone, and you're going to take a message from me." Mark frowned, confused. Richard took from his pocket the document Hope had found and a letter he had written during the night. "I want you to deliver this to Lawyer Smith. It's the deed to the Willow Creek farm. I want it returned to the Johnson family, at no cost to them." Mark looked at Richard as if he had gone mad. "Boss, do you know how much that property is worth?" "I know exactly how much it's worth, and I also know how much a night of peaceful sleep is worth." "But boss..." "I'm not your boss anymore, Mark, and this is just the first property. In the coming weeks, I want all the lands that were taken irregularly to be returned to their rightful owners." Mark was silent for a few seconds, processing what he was hearing. "You've completely lost your mind. This is financial suicide." "Maybe," agreed Richard, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm doing the right thing." After Mark left, visibly shocked and annoyed, Richard felt lighter than he had felt in years. He had taken the first concrete step to fix his mistakes, and even knowing that it would cost dearly, he felt at peace. Hope ran to him, sensing that something important had happened. "Richard, you look different. Happier." "That's because I'm learning to be the person you always thought I was," he replied, hugging the girl who had become his greatest inspiration. The following weeks brought changes that no one in the small rural community could have imagined. Richard had initiated a process that would shake not only his own life, but that of hundreds of families who had lost their lands to his developments over the years. The first family to receive the news that their property would be returned was the Johnson family. When the lawyer arrived in the nearest town with the transfer documents, the news spread like wildfire in the dry countryside. A major landowner was returning lands he had taken. It was unprecedented, almost impossible to believe. Richard followed. These changes from Teresa's house, where he had decided to remain while organizing the return of all properties acquired irregularly. Each night he studied documents by lamplight, identifying which lands had been unjustly taken and which families had the right to receive them back. Hope observed Richard work with growing curiosity. "Richard, why are you looking at these papers? Every night?" "I'm trying to remember all the families I hurt so I can help them now." "Is it like a guessing game?" she asked, with the simplicity of childhood. "No, little one. It's like I had broken many toys belonging to other children, and now I'm trying to fix all of them." Hope nodded, understanding the analogy perfectly. "That's good, Richard. My grandma always says that when we break something, we have to fix it. But Richard's actions didn't go unnoticed by everyone. His former partners and competitors began to pressure him to reconsider his decisions. Phones rang constantly at the only telephone booth in the nearby town with urgent messages for Richard Montgomery. One morning, 3 men in suits arrived at Teresa's house in air-conditioned cars, contrasting brutally with the simplicity of the place. They were lawyers and executives from companies that had business with Richard. "Mr. Montgomery," said the oldest of them, a man with graying hair and a serious expression, "we need to talk urgently about your recent decisions." Richard received them on the porch, noticing how Hope hid behind Teresa, intimidated by the strangers. "What can I do for you?" "Sir, your actions are causing chaos in the region's real estate market. There are established contracts, financial commitments, investors who depend on these properties." "I understand your concerns, but my decision is made." The younger lawyer leaned forward. "Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, you cannot simply undo years of legally established business. There are enormous legal and financial consequences. Legally established, perhaps. Morally, that's another question." The men exchanged worried looks. Clearly they didn't expect to find a Richard Montgomery talking about morality. "Sir," insisted the older lawyer, "are you ill? Have you suffered some trauma? These decisions are completely contrary to everything we know about your business. Personality." Richard looked at Hope, who was watching him with large, trusting eyes, even though she was frightened by the visitors. "You're right. I've changed, and I don't intend to go back to who I was before." After the lawyers left, visibly frustrated, Teresa approached Richard. "My son, are you sure of what you're doing?" These men seemed very concerned. "I'm sure, Teresa. For the first time in a long time, I'm absolutely sure of something." But the pressures didn't stop there. The following week, a visit arrived that would definitively test Richard's transformation. His ex-wife, Helen, arrived with Caroline, his 8-year-old daughter. Helen had become an elegant and successful woman, a lawyer in New York, accustomed to the luxury that Richard's money provided. She arrived in an imported car, wearing expensive clothes, and her expression clearly showed her shock at seeing the conditions in which Richard was living. "Richard, for God's sake, what happened to you?" were her first words, after getting out of the car and looking around the simple property. Caroline, however, reacted differently. The girl observed everything with curiosity, and when she saw Hope peeking shyly from the door of the house, she smiled and waved. "Hi, what's your name?" asked Caroline, approaching without the ceremony of adults. "Hope," replied the country girl, still shy but returning the smile. "What a pretty name. Do you want to play with me?" In a few minutes, the 2 girls were playing in the yard as if they had been friends for years. Richard observed the scene with emotion. It was the first time he had seen his daughter interact with a child in such a natural and carefree way. Helen, however, was furious. "Richard, I need to talk to you in private." They moved away to the shade of a tree, where Helen couldn't contain her indignation. "Have you completely lost your mind? You're living like a beggar in the middle of nowhere, and on top of that, you're giving away all the assets we built?" "Helen, No, let me speak. Caroline needs the money for her education, for her future. You don't have the right to throw it all away because of an existential crisis." Richard looked at the 2 girls playing. Caroline, accustomed to expensive toys and programmed activities, seemed genuinely happy playing house with corn dolls that Hope had made. "Helen, look at our daughter. When was the last time you saw her so happy?" "That's beside the point. Happiness doesn't pay for private school, doesn't pay for health insurance, doesn't pay... And what's the use of paying for all that if she grows up being an empty person, inside like I was?" Helen stared at him, seeing a seriousness in Richard that she had never noticed before. "You really have changed, haven't you?" "Completely." That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Helen, watching Caroline play with Hope, began to understand what Richard was trying to tell her. She saw her daughter sharing her expensive toys with a girl who had almost nothing, and realized that Caroline had never shown such spontaneous generosity. When it was time to leave, Caroline didn't want to go. "Daddy, can I stay a little longer? Hope is going to teach me how to make corn dolls." "No, Caroline, we need to go back to New York," said Helen, but her voice didn't have its usual firmness. "Mom, why can't Daddy come with us? He seems very happy here." Helen looked at Richard, who was helping Hope show Caroline how to braid straw. There was a peace in his movements, a lightness in his smile that she hadn't seen in years. "Caroline," said Richard, kneeling to the girls, "Height, Daddy needs to stay here a little longer to finish some important things, but you can come back to visit me whenever you want." "Promise?" "I promise." After Helen and Caroline left, Richard felt a mixture of sadness and determination. He knew he was losing many things that he once considered important, but he also knew he was gaining something much more valuable. In the weeks that followed, the property returns continued. Each family that got their land back reacted with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Some came personally to thank him, others simply couldn't believe it was true. Richard followed each case and slowly began to notice changes in how he was viewed by the local community. The mysterious man that Hope had brought was becoming someone respected, not through fear or power, but through the justice of his actions. Mr. John was one of the first to change his attitude. "Son," he said one afternoon, "I don't know what you did wrong out there, but what you're doing now is right. There are a lot of families happy because of you." Little Joe, the young man who dreamed of getting married, received news that his family had recovered the small property they had lost years before. "Now I can marry my girlfriend and have a place to live with her," he said, with tears in his eyes. But the greatest transformation Richard saw was in himself. Each property returned, each family reunited with their land. Each grateful smile he received made him feel richer than he had ever felt when he had millions. One night, 6 months after his arrival in that dry countryside, Richard was sitting on the porch with Hope and Teresa, watching the sunset paint the rural sky golden red. "Richard," said Hope, resting her head on his shoulder, "are you still sad about losing all your money?" Richard chuckled softly. "You know something, little. One, I discovered that I didn't lose anything. In fact, I gained much more than I had." "How so?" "Before I had a lot of money, but I was a poor person inside. Now I don't have money, but I'm truly rich." Hope thought for a moment. "Rich in what?" "Rich in true friends like you. Rich in peace of heart. Rich in being able to sleep peacefully. Every night." Teresa smiled, rocking in the rocking chair that Richard had fixed for her. "That's true wealth, my son. It took time, but you learned." 3 months later, Richard made a final decision. With the help of honest lawyers, he created a cooperative that brought together all the families who had recovered their lands. The goal was to work together, share resources and knowledge, ensuring that everyone could prosper. The cooperative was set up at the former headquarters of one of his farms, which was transformed into a community center. Hope and Teresa moved there too, to a simple but comfortable house that Richard built for them. On the day of the official inauguration of the cooperative, hundreds of people gathered, entire families who had lost their lands and now had them back. Children running and playing freely on land that once again belonged to their parents. Elderly people crying with emotion at being able to spend their last years in the place where they were born. Richard, who had once been feared by all those present, was now welcomed with warm hugs and words of gratitude. But the most emotional moment was when an elderly lady approached him. "Are you Richard Montgomery?" she asked with a trembling voice. "Yes, ma'am. I'm the mother of Jack Johnson, the young man who helped put you in that state when the girl found you." Richard felt his heart race. "Ma'am, No, let me speak," she interrupted. "My son was wrong to hurt you even though you took our land. Violence is never the answer. But I want you to know that he's working on the family land again, and he's happier than I've seen him in years." She came closer and held Richard's hands. "Thank you, son. Thank you for giving us back our dignity." That night, after all the celebrations, Richard was walking around the property with Hope. The girl had grown a few inches in recent months, but she remained the same wise and generous child who had saved him. "Hope," he said, stopping under a tree where they had built a swing, "do you remember the day you found me?" "I remember. You were in bad shape and the white horse was tired. If I had asked you that day if you thought I could change, what would you have answered?" Hope thought seriously, swinging slowly on the swing. I would have said yes, because Grandma always says that everyone can change if they really want. 2. And if I ask you now if you think I've changed? She stopped swinging and looked right into his eyes. You've changed so much that you seem like a different person. But at the same time, it seems like you were always like this inside. You just didn't know it. Richard hugged the girl, feeling his eyes fill with tears. You're right, little one. I always had this good person inside me. I just needed someone like you to show me where she was hidden. 6 months later, Caroline came back for a longer visit. This time, Helen came with a different proposal. Richard, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. How about if Caroline spent her vacations here with you? She can't stop talking about Hope and all the things she learned on her last visit. Richard agreed emotionally, and for the first time in years, had the opportunity to really get to know his daughter. Caroline quickly adapted to the simple life of the cooperative, playing with the other children, helping with community activities, learning values that no expensive school could teach. One afternoon, while the two girls were playing near the stream, Caroline asked a question that surprised Richard. Daddy, why don't you come back to New York? You seem much happier here. And you, Caroline? Would you be happy living here? The girl looked around, seeing Hope teaching other children to make straw toys, seeing families working together in the community garden, feeling the peace that existed in that place. I think so, Daddy. Here people really care about each other. That night, Richard had a long phone conversation with Helen. To his surprise, she was considering the possibility of moving to the region, opening a law office to help small producers and rural families. Richard, you've achieved something I thought was impossible. You've completely changed from the inside out. And seeing Caroline so happy here, I'm beginning to understand that money really might not be the most important thing in life. 2 years after Richard's arrival in that dry countryside, the cooperative had become a model of sustainable and fair development. Dozens of families worked together, sharing resources, knowledge, and profits. The children attended a community school where they learned not only traditional subjects, but also values such as solidarity, cooperation, and care for the environment. Richard, now with graying hair and hands calloused from working the land, had found a happiness he didn't know was possible. Every day he worked alongside the families he had once harmed, and every day he felt grateful for the second chance life had given him. Hope, now 8 years old, had become the soul of that community. Her natural generosity and precocious wisdom inspired adults and children alike. She continued to be the first to help those in need, the first to share what she had, the first to believe that it was always possible to improve. On a special afternoon, when the entire community gathered to celebrate 2 years of the cooperative, Richard was invited to speak. He stood up before hundreds of people who represented transformed families, rebuilt lives, renewed hopes. Friends, he began, his voice choked. 2 years ago, I arrived here as a broken man, wounded, running from the consequences of a lifetime of wrong decisions. I had a lot of money, but I was poor in spirit. I had power, but I didn't have peace. I had material possessions, but I didn't have true love. He looked for Hope in the crowd and smiled when he saw her sitting next to Teresa and Caroline, who now spent half the year at the cooperative. A 6-year-old girl taught me that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we share. That true strength isn't in dominating others, but in serving others. That true happiness doesn't come from what we receive, but from what we give. People applauded, but Richard raised his hand, indicating that he hadn't finished. Today I want to make one last announcement. The remainder of all my personal assets will be transferred to a fund that will ensure the operation of this cooperative for generations. Because I've learned that the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't money in the bank, but a better world for our children. The applause was deafening, but Richard only had eyes for Hope, who ran to him and hugged him tightly. Richard, she whispered in his ear, "You did it. You became a truly good person." "No, little one," he replied, hugging her back. "I was always a good person. You taught me how to find that person inside me." That night, under the starry country sky, Richard reflected on his journey. He had lost millions, but gained something that was priceless: peace of mind. He had lost power over others, but gained power over himself. He had lost the luxurious life, but gained a life with meaning. And it had all begun with a 6-year-old girl who decided to help an injured stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. Hope had been her name and her mission, transforming not only Richard's life, but that of an entire community. Looking at the lights of the houses where the families who had recovered their lands lived, Richard smiled. He had discovered that true wealth wasn't in having everything, but in sharing everything. It wasn't in being served, but in serving. It wasn't in being feared, but in being loved. And so, in that arid land of rural America, where once there had been only poverty and despair, flourished a prosperous community built on the simplest and most precious values of humanity: love, generosity, forgiveness, and hope. The transformation was complete. The man who had arrived there injured and, fleeing from his past, had become the leader of a silent revolution, a revolution based not on violence or power, but on kindness and justice, and all because a girl named Hope believed that every person deserves a second chance. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard and Hope has touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that it's never too late to change, that true wealth is in the relationships we build and the good we do for others. To continue this emotional journey with us, we've prepared a special playlist with equally touching stories. You can find it by clicking here beside us. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of human life and teach us about eternal values such as love, forgiveness, and hope. Don't miss our next content and tell us